Good evening and welcome. My name is Chase Robinson, and to me belongs the great privilege of welcoming you all to the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, of which I have the privilege of being the president. I'd like to extend a welcome to all of you who are here at 365 Fifth Avenue, but also the estimated audience of 1 million to 100 million, I'm told, joining us via live stream around the world. It is indeed a great honor to host part of the job interview in front of the world, as Newsweek recently described it. Credentials for the Secretary General role are daunting, to say the least. Franklin Roosevelt envisioned the position as that of world moderator, a description further refined by the UN as, quote, diplomat and advocate, civil servant, and CEO of some 80,000 civilian officials and over 100,000 peacekeepers. According to the UN's architects, the Secretary General should know when to force an issue and be dynamic, and when to be content as purely administrative official, and when, on a middle course, to be a moderator. That is, it seems to me, to steer the perfect course in often the most precarious of circumstances and with ramifications for tens of millions. With us this evening are major contenders to become the 9th Secretary General. That they gather at all, I think, signals an unprecedented shift in UN history, turning what for 7 decades was a closed process into a truly public and global event. How fortunate we are here at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York to host such a historic conversation, which features 3 very serious candidates for this most important of all position. The conversation tonight is very much aligned with what we do here at the City University of New York. City University of New York can be viewed as an extraordinary project in promoting social progress and equality. Some of you may be interested to know that of the university's undergraduates, 42% are the first in their families to go to college. A full 40% of CUNY students come from households with annual incomes below $20,000. The Graduate Center, which focuses on doctoral degrees in advancing teaching and research, is a crucial part of that extraordinary project that is the university. Every year, our 4,200 or so doctoral students teach about 200,000 CUNY undergraduates across all 5 boroughs of the city. The Graduate Center is also a leading venue for the study of international relations, reflected most prominently in our Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies. Under its auspices is one of tonight's sponsors, the Future UN Development System Project. Behind both of these is a good friend and colleague, Presidential Professor Tom Weiss, a distinguished scholar and a leading expert on the UN, who was recently named an Andrew Carnegie Fellow and will serve as tonight's co-moderator. He's written some 50 books, including What's Wrong with the United Nations and How to Fix It. One reviewer has called this required reading list for the US president and the leaders of other nations as well. Joining him as co-moderator is Barbara Crossette, UN correspondent for The Nation, and a former correspondent for the New York Times, as well as the author of several books on Asia. We could not be more delighted to welcome all of our guests, in particular 2 other partners, Global Citizen and the United Nations Association of the United Kingdom. It's now my very great pleasure to introduce Natalie Samara Singh, UNA UK's Executive Director and a founder of the 147 Billion campaign. Thank you, and do enjoy the evening.
Thank you very much, Chase, for reminding us just how important the UN's top job is, particularly at this time, and of course for your generosity in hosting us here today. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a real pleasure to introduce tonight's proceedings on behalf of UNA UK, which I have the privilege to lead, even though I am not actually British at all. This has some drawbacks, especially right now when migrants aren't exactly the flavor of the month, but it also has some benefits, mostly because I can be very un-British and say how proud I am of UNA UK's role in the 1 for 7 billion campaign, without which events like this one, and indeed the town hall with candidates last night at the UN, simply wouldn't have been possible. We wouldn't have even known the names of the candidates, let alone had a chance to engage with them. So I think we've moved quite some way from the bad old days when the appointment was made in secret, subject to the whims of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the P5, who, let's face it, don't always have the best interests of the UN at heart. And with the help of our partners, and I should mention in particular the President of the General Assembly, we now have for the first time in the UN's history a public list of candidates, their vision statements, an idea of how they would approach the task of leading the UN, a chance for all member states to engage with them, and a field that isn't limited to men from a particular region. We were very keen to complement this new process by organizing debates where questions from the public, which is the UN's most important but often sidelined constituency, were front and center. And this is the third event we've held with our partners at CUNY and Global Citizen. At the first event we held in April, I think I made quite a smug comment about the quality of the Republican primary debates, in particular the very incisive remarks about the size of candidates' hands. At the second debate in London, I joked about needing to eat my words because this was sort of when the Brexit debate, I think, crossed over into the realm of fiction and fear-mongering. And today, those little jokes, they really just don't seem very funny anymore. We will hear tonight about some of the deep challenges facing the world, such as climate change, pandemics, terrorism. But I think one of the hardest challenges that we face is the post-truth environment that we now seem to have entered, when experts, people who actually know stuff, are derided, when our opinions are based on a sort of self-selected media, and when saying something loud enough, often enough, and in a shocking enough way, sort of makes it become fact. This is part of a broader global trend. I think across the world there's growing disconnect in politicians and institutions, from the Arab uprisings to the resurgence of populist movements in Europe. People are rejecting the status quo, and governments just aren't sure how to cope. Often they've responded by turning inwards, leading to, I think, a deficit in global leadership at a time when it is needed more than ever, and at a time when I think all of the P5 in different ways seem to be going through some sort of state version of a midlife crisis as they struggle to redefine the role that they play in the world. All of this makes the UN much more important. It's our stronghold against isolationism, but it's also overstretched and underfunded. The next Secretary General will need to restore confidence in the international system and to demonstrate to governments and people that going it alone just isn't an option anymore. The line between national and global challenges has disappeared, and an effective UN is now in everyone's national interest. That's why the 1 for 7 billion campaign will keep pushing for a highly capable Secretary General and for them to be able to deliver without the shadow of reappointment hanging over their head and with the freedom to recruit the best possible people to their team. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted that we have with us 3 of the distinguished candidates vying for what has been called the world's most impossible job. In alphabetical order, Cristiana Figueres from Costa Rica, who's just stepped down as Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Vuk Jeremic, the former Serbian Foreign Minister, was President of the General Assembly from 2012 to 2013. And Danilo Turk, former President of Slovenia and former UN Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs. So I'll now leave all of you candidates and the audience in the hands of our moderators, UN guru Tom Weiss, who you've just heard all about, and Barbara Crossette, who's been following the UN for The Nation, New York Times, and Pass Blue, the unmissable read for UN nerds. She's been scrutinizing the UN longer and more closely than any other journalist I know. And a final word of advice to the candidates, I think she might be the bad cop tonight. And I very much hope that you all will be good cop and bad cop as well, using the hashtag NextSG. So Barbara and Tom, over to you.
Well, thanks, Chase, for those excessively kind words of introduction, and Natalie as well. I should have worn my saffron robe, but I left it home. Let me add my own warm words of welcome here to the Graduate Center, which has been my intellectual home, a very congenial one for the last 2 decades. Well, Christiana and Vuk and Danilo, you're the beneficiaries of a lot of work by Natalie and company through the 1 for 7 billion. We all know that Trygve Lie said this was the world's most impossible job. For some of us in this room, we also think it's one of the world's most important, although not all member states look upon it that way. We know that straw polls will begin this month. We're not sure when the white smoke will come out of the Security Council chamber, but we're hoping we have an impact on that. Natalie mentioned this is actually the first time in 70 years of history, or second time, in which the US presidential campaign and the selection process have coincided. I'm not the only person in this room, including Natalie, who are pleased with the dignity and the decency of this campaign in contrast with the one we have going on locally. Let me sort of explain what my bad cop friend here, Barbara, and I have in mind, which is that we'll be asking some questions based on our own reading of the World Organization. We've also solicited some questions from UN staff, also from other people in the audience, and most particularly from a survey done by our partners, Global Citizen, who over the last 3 months have been asking people, what would you like to ask of these candidates? They've received some 30,000 replies. We're not going to use all of those this evening, but from 161 countries, and so we'll put a couple of those on the table as well. We're hoping this is more a conversation than a set of speeches. We've asked people to be brief and to the point. Either Barbara or I will ask a follow-up question when necessary. We're hoping over the next 80 minutes, 78 minutes, to have 4 sets of conversations. We'll obviously have to arbitrarily stop them. We're going to start with climate change and sustainable development. We're then going to move to human rights and humanitarian action, followed by international peace and security, and then ending up with the staff, the secretariat, and management concerns. I'm going to start with climate change, and as Danilo is an expert on all things human rights and political, we decided we'd start with him on climate change. We all know that the charter begins with those words, stop succeeding generations, or save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Lots of people in surveys that my research project has done, Global Citizen has done, climate change actually comes out on top. If we're talking about an existential challenge for your granddaughter or mine, nothing actually could be more important. So the questions that came in varied, but I think they come down to saying, what actually can a Secretary General do to keep governments' feet to the fire so that they actually pay attention to some of the things that they agreed in Paris? Nilo.
Thank you, Tom. I would like to thank everybody for coming to this discussion, and I hope we are going to have a lively discussion. Before answering, I have to say 2 things. First, Tom, I've read your book, What's Wrong with the United Nations and How to Fix It. I read it 3 years ago, and I reread it 3 months ago when I was preparing my vision statement for the candidature. So you can be satisfied with some of the
It's going to help sales immensely.
Well, I must say the fixing part was more difficult than the trouble part.
Yes.
But then the second thing I would like to say, really, I'd like to thank Natalie and the United Nations Association of United Kingdom, and especially to somebody who is not here, Sir Jeremy Greenstock, who was president of the association until a few weeks ago, with whom we have discussed this concept of such meetings in February when I was in London. And Jeremy was a great leader in the United Nations. We were together in East Timor and Jakarta for the East Timor discussions leading to the peacekeeping operation and later to independence of East Timor. And we have talked about all aspects of the United Nations in the context of a specific crisis situation. Now, this brings me to your question, because now I think the people around the world understand more and more that the climate change is a fundamental challenge and a problem which leads to wars. We have seen this in Darfur. We have seen this in Syria. So it's also a question of peace and security, not a, technically speaking, environmental question. And therefore, it's a pressing priority for the United Nations and for the Secretary General. Now, coming to more specific part of this answer, and here I speak with some trepidation, because Christiana was intimately involved in all this, so she must have a much more detailed agenda. But my suggestion about the immediate tasks, I would only choose two, because I think, list shouldn't be too long, but two. One is ratification of the Paris Agreement. We had this wonderful ceremony in New York in April, signatures, but let us make sure that the agreement is ratified by a sufficient number of countries, sufficiently relevant countries, and sufficiently early. This is an important political task. This shouldn't be left to sovereignty as a purely free choice of states. There should be some sort of urgency in this, and the Secretary General must add to that with various initiatives. The second thing actually happens this year, and I'm a bit worried to see that the third Habitat Conference in Quito, in Ecuador, hasn't yet received the public attention it deserves. I was at the second Habitat in Istanbul 20 years ago, and I have seen how important urban development is for the entire future development of the world and for the entire story about climate change. Now, cities produce about 60% of the world output, but they also produce 70% of greenhouse gases. They are a major problem, and they have to be managed better. Now, here we have an immediate task, how to direct this development, and that will be discussed in Quito in October. But for the Secretary General, I think it would be important to bring the city leaders, city policymakers, city administrators into the United Nations more actively. United Nations is about nation states, but it should be more and more about partnerships with city leaders. Of course, there are already models in place, but that should be expanded. Now, I could go on, but I wanted to stop with these two priorities.
Thanks, Daniil. Barbara, you want to jump in?
Yeah, logically following out of that, I'm not a bad cop, by the way. I don't think so, was I? I think at the start, before we get into the deep down aspects of being a Secretary General, it's worth remembering that the Secretary General is really the employee of an organization with 193 board members. And so there has to be a relationship. Now, I was going to start with Christiana because she saw it firsthand last year in Paris, not necessarily with the General Assembly as a body, but the fact that there are so many points of view in so many countries that have to be negotiated with, cajoled. In fact, I think this year there had to be some certain countries cajoled into accepting this process. So that, and then on to Vuk, who has been on the other side. He's been president of the General Assembly, and he can speak about the relationship with the Secretary General and what that needs to be, since all of these problems, as Daniela has just said, are basically global. So talk a little bit, if you want, or what you learned from getting this group of disparate countries in line for this agreement, which is historic.
Well, thanks. Like Daniela, I wanted to, before jumping in, truly to thank you, Natalie, for the vision that you had to start this amazing campaign, which, as you know, and as I suspected, but you've now confirmed, has gone even way beyond your expectations. And I actually take a lot of comfort and a lot of hope by the fact that, am I right, 200 million? Who are following this process. So I think that demonstrates not just interest in the UN, but but still a vote of confidence that we need to live up to. So it's both hope, but a huge responsibility. So thank you very much for that. And Tom, I must confess, I have not read your book. I have it sitting somewhere in a pile of books that I still have to read, but I very much look forward to both the diagnosis and the fix-it part. So thank you very much for that, and Barbara for following this so closely. So I was very impressed that Natalie opened up today saying, among other things, that we are at a point in which the global, or I think you called it the UN, is of national interest. And I think that is the phrase. That is the phrase because, frankly, after 6 years of picking up a multilateral process that was in the garbage can after Copenhagen and restoring hope and confidence and building trust and constructing a pathway forward, what truly, other than patience and listening to everyone, but what really made us turn the corner was precisely for all of us to realize that addressing climate change is certainly a global issue, but that it is at the same time a national priority. And when you see these two things actually reinforcing each other, when you invite countries, as we did, to present their national climate change plans, and we're totally bowled over that we had more than 180 national climate change plans, that was a real confirmation that we had completely turned the argument on its head. And it was no longer being perceived as only a burden, but rather as a huge opportunity. Because addressing climate change brings energy security, food security, water security, national security, on and on and on and on. And so to be able to find that point of coincidence of national interest and global interest was really I think the make it or break it of the Paris Agreement. And once we had that understanding, Barbara, then you can see that it wasn't about, yes, they also had to agree to a global process that they've agreed to, and it's legally binding and unanimous, let me say, and ambitious, and moves forward on a path into the future, but that it was really seen as this very, very important coincidence. And I have the suspicion that that lesson learned is not a lesson that is only unique to climate change. I actually have a suspicion that being able to explore how national and global interests do reinforce each other is probably a very good way to approach many other issues that we're dealing with at the UN. And
there, as a footnote, as you know, to that, increasingly the trend in the United Nations is national ownership of issues. It's happened with the Sustainable Development Goals and of course with the climate change agreement. So the idea that countries have to take this really and make it a high priority is an interesting one. It is a trend, and it's going to continue.
Absolutely, which dovetails with your comment about bringing cities on board, which they are. We had more than 1,000 mayors in Paris, because they have understood that. They have understood that it is, that there really is an alignment here from community to cities, to regions, states, provinces, to national, to global. And so that alignment of interest and that alignment of urgency, I think, is really fundamental.
Okay, so Book, we want to hear from you. You've seen it from the other side of the barricade.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you everybody for joining us. I want to thank the organizers and in particular the UNA UK. This is the second time that I am part of this exercise. I think it's very important to bring in transparency into this process. This is a great exercise in shedding more light into the process, but I'll go straight to the question and how it felt to be on the other side. It felt very weird. I was elected president of the United Nations General Assembly for the 67th session. And what I found out was that I was not invited to the COP meeting that was taking place in Doha. It was COP 18, if I'm not mistaken. And actually, now that I'm no longer president of the General Assembly, I can speak a little bit more freely about it, but there was a very, very significant struggle behind the scenes to actually get an invitation for the President of the General Assembly to go to Doha. Secretary General, of course, was supposed to be there, but it wasn't something expected for the President of the General Assembly to be there. Well, I put my foot down and I said that I was going to organize a thematic debate on climate change in the General Assembly on the same day of the COP, if I were not to be invited, and I ended up being invited to Doha, which I felt very important. Actually, this is where I met Christina for the first time. And,
Christina is correct.
And I want to basically congratulate you for the heavy lifting that you've done after the Copenhagen to make sure that the COP21 proves to be a great success. Back then, COP18, Doha, there was very, very little understanding in the General Assembly, which is mostly dominated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs representatives, of what the Environment Ministry's representatives were doing there. Today, we are in a much better place. I think that there is a much deeper and better understanding of how significant this issue is. It has to be embedded into the national policies and national strategies of various countries. I think this is going to be one of the critical tasks for the next Secretary General, to make sure that the great job and the heavy lifting that was pulled in Paris actually becomes a reality.
Yeah, better informed, that's a very important point you make, better informed delegations.
Better informed delegation. I mean,
which is a big step forward.
Before being president of the General Assembly, I was a foreign minister. I have to say, well, Serbia is not the best organized country in the world, but it's not the worst organized country in the world either. I had very, very little knowledge of what my colleague, the environment minister, and his staff were doing within the COP negotiations. I think that this has now changed. I think that the world is now much more acutely aware of how grave this challenge is for humanity. And the next Secretary General will have to be decisive
I think we're
in
going
addressing
to, yeah, then
this.
we're going to.
I'm going to break in here a minute because I'd like to get a question from Bolivia, but that's going to be presented by Simon Moss, who's the managing director of Global Citizen, which is linked, I hope, and we'll come back to let each of you jump in on this for a minute each, to the whole notion that Barbara brought up of who owns this institution. Simon?
Over the last 3 months, we've had more than 30,000 global citizens and supporters from the 1 for 7 Billion coalition vote and rank what questions they'd like to ask you as candidates as the next potential Secretary General. Climate change and sustainable development came at the top, and one of the leading questions we got came in the form of a very specific question that I'd like to get your opinion on. This particular one came from a global citizen in Bolivia who said, "What specific, real and practical actions are you going to take to put pressure on the rich world countries to reduce their carbon emissions and to help stop climate change?"
Danilo, go ahead for a minute.
Now, on the specific questions, as I said before, I mean, the first thing, of course, would be the ratification of the Paris Agreement. But that's probably not specific enough in terms of the philosophy of the question that you have raised. What I think would be very interesting, and I would like to hear the views of the other two, is the subsidization of carbon. We have that practice, and that practice has to change. The question is, should the Secretary General be in the forefront of this effort? Now, things are changing, and what appeared to be very far from Secretary General's purview in the past is no longer relevant necessarily. So I think there will be a need to look into this sort of questions and give them priority status after a discussion. So I believe that the discussions around ratification and the immediate tasks, including the Habitat Conference and others, which are really very soon, the question of subsidization of carbon would be really a very important priority to take.
Christiana?
Well, at the risk of sounding a little bit techie, the fantastic way that the Paris Agreement has been structured is that it is based on a collection of, as I mentioned before, national climate change plans, the sum total of which do not get us to below 2 degrees, let alone 1.5, which is where we should be headed. However, what is very important to understand is that those national climate change plans that we have from over 180 countries represent only the first step. And that what is legally binding in the Paris Agreement is the process of constant improvement. So every 5 years, countries have to come together to see how adequate their effort has been, and you can already predict it is not currently adequate, and then they have to improve their effort. Fortunately, we also have a much quicker milestone, which is going to be 2018, in which countries will already see how much are they doing and what is the relationship between that effort and the 1.5, because we will have a scientific report on 1.5 degrees, and these two things will be matched up. So I do think that there is a long-term process in place already built into the Paris Agreement that will allow us to get on track, because we're currently, frankly, not on track.
Well, can I switch gears? Simply because my Germanic roots are squirming. We're already behind schedule. And we've got 3 big other topics to go on. And I'd actually like to segue to human rights and humanitarian action, a huge topic. In a research project I was involved, the book on the intellectual history of the United Nations describes human rights as one of the signature accomplishments. The subtitle was Unfinished Revolution. Well, certainly part of the frontier remaining, and it's a topic that's gone all over the map at the UN, has been LGBT rights. And so we had several questions from Simon's survey, some from younger folks in one of the 70 to 80 or however many countries in which homosexuality is illegal, saying, what are you going to do for me? And in particular, if you don't do what you say you're going to do, is there a way to hold you accountable? So that one's for you.
Well, thanks for raising this issue. I think it's actually a very important one. The human rights in general are one of the 3 fundamental pillars of the United Nations, which in my opinion are critically under-resourced in the current structure. And what I decided to do when it comes to my vision for this candidacy was actually to spell out in detail what I intend to do in case I get elected. I believe that this is a precedent, that somebody decides to put forward and make publicly available a platform that has 53 concrete commitments as to what I intend to do if I get elected. A quarter of which actually relate to human rights, and in particular to the issue that you're raising. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, I think, deserves great credit for making great strides. The UN has made great strides in this field in the past few years, and with the Free and Equal campaign, which I commit myself to supporting and pushing forward. But Secretary General Ban Ki-moon did not say this prior to getting elected. I do say this prior to potentially getting elected. This is my concrete commitment to support it strongly, not to backpedal on any of the achievements that Secretary Ban Ki-moon has made, and to push it further. In principle, human rights are going to be one of the most critical priorities that I intend to pursue in case I get elected Secretary General, and I did not shy away from putting it down, writing it down, and making it publicly available.
Barbara, why don't you jump in there,
Christiana, Latin America and North America, but Latin America was very prominent in introducing the last resolution on LGBT rights. And it's interesting, Latin America is ahead on a number of social issues. Just very briefly, talk a little bit about that, because people would say, as they often do, well, here's a conservative religious continent, here's this, here's that. And yet Latin America, we'll talk later maybe about violence against women, but that's universal. How did it happen in Latin America?
Well, Barbara, if I may, I would like to pivot to the global level, because I do believe that that is the responsibility of the Secretary General to see these issues at the global level. Fortunately, I would say that since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, a year that is very important globally, but also for Costa Rica, humanity has been on a journey of increasing awareness, understanding, and increasing respect for human rights. That has also brought increasing expectations of respect of human rights in many areas in which perhaps in 1948 it was not considered. That's a very good thing. And I do believe that, in fact, many of the issues that we will discuss tonight, we will see that humanity is on a journey, but certainly on human rights. Very specifically on the one that you are referring to, on sexual orientation. It is a human right. It is very, very clear in the Declaration of Human Rights, and it is supported in the Charter. I believe that as we move through this journey, the responsibility here of the Secretary General is certainly to uphold both the Declaration and the Charter, and to do that in a very sensitive way that both respects cultural practices, religious beliefs that are also human rights, and finds ways to have conversations that are difficult conversations, but those cultural practices and religious beliefs cannot deny individual human rights. So that kind of a conversation, that are difficult conversations, need to occur. And it is in that conversation that we will be able to take the next step, and that won't be a perfect step, but it is a step in our journey.
Danilo, I'm going to open this up just a tad by getting a couple of questions from the audience on a related issue. One of the other things that was controversial, remains controversial, even though it's hard to believe, is women's rights of one sort or another. And I've got two questions, actually one from Zaima Abbas, who works at the Global Citizen, with a response to the questionnaire from Saudi Arabia. And then a second and related question from Sally Sharif, who's a PhD student here, who's actually an intern at the UN and has another perspective, but both related to women. Friends?
So this question, like you said, comes from Global Citizen Saudi Arabia, and they ask, it's 2016 and violence against women is still on the rise. What would you do to encourage other countries to increase their efforts and promote gender equality, educate both genders without sexism, and to end violence? Thank you.
Sally? We're going to take these two together, please. Sorry.
Hi, this is mainly a question for Christiana. When Barack Obama was elected as the first black president in the United States, people had hopes that that would improve the quality of the African Americans in this country. Now, 8 years after, many of those hopes are unfulfilled. As much as we would like to see a female Secretary General, I would like to know how that femaleness would contribute to, first, keeping the gender balance in the Secretariat, and second, in improving in women's rights across the world. Thank you.
Danilo, why don't you take the first one, and Christiana the second, and Book, you can chime in.
I wouldn't mind making comments on both.
By all means. But within your 2 minutes, okay.
Go for it.
Now look, I have spent much of my professional and other life in human rights. Activism, human rights, expertise, participating in drafting of various UN instruments and also implementation of instruments. Now, as Secretary General, I think Secretary General must, every morning before coming to the office, once again bring to his mind the Article 28 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Tom, you are a professor, you should know what that article says. But in order to make it easier, I will quote it.
I'm not a professor of law.
Everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which all of his human rights can be fully realized. Now, that was the level of optimism of 1948 and the level of ambition. And ever since then, the organized international community is involved in building those orders. We are still at a very low level, but we have to progress. And obviously, a critically important part of that progression is equality of men and women. Clearly, without equality, you cannot talk properly about human rights. And I think the Secretary General has to be seen as a human rights activist for equality and non-discrimination. And of course, that involves equality in all societies. Of course, I know that not all societies are at the same level of understanding of what the achievable equality is. But that's where activism comes in, and that's where the Secretary General has to be involved. And of course, the Secretary General is not only a human rights activist, he also has to be a diplomat. And I remember discussing this with Kofi Annan when I worked for him as his political advisor. He discussed these issues in places where these are not easy issues, including in Iran and in other places. And he said, it is like a bird needing two wings. A society cannot function without both wings. And a kind of a simple metaphor helps a lot in this kind of discussions. And obviously then a specific program has to be worked out, specific targets have to be worked out and achieved. And I think the Secretary General has to work wherever he goes for this type of purpose. Now, on the question of the UN Secretariat, I think the critical importance there is to improve the gender balance in the Secretariat at all levels. The important thing here is that there has to be equality of opportunity. And the Secretariat hasn't done enough for that to be part of the whole recruitment policy and personnel policy. So we need that. We need a system of promotions which would create a mid-level equality of opportunity and balance. And obviously from that also levels at the top, at the quality of opportunity and balance at the top level. Now, of course, you would say, well, this is long-term, what would you as candidate do immediately? And my answer would be, well, I have been thinking about this and I have been compiling a list of about a dozen of highly experienced, very respected, and extremely competent and reliable women whom I know from the Secretariat who can be appointed to highest positions. It's too early to reveal the names, but the day will come.
Christiana.
Well, I think there are three things that we need to prioritize with respect to gender parity. The first is incontrovertibly to stop violence against women and children. Stop violence in all of its different manifestations. The second is to ensure in all of the enabling environment that there is parity, and that means equal access to education, equal pay for the equal job, equal land ownership rights, all of the aspects that have to do with the enabling context. And the third, perhaps that relates more to your question, has to do with equal parity, gender parity in positions of authority, of decision making. Obviously, I didn't know that Kofi Annan, one of my fantastic heroes, used the visual image of two wings because it's actually very similar to what I have been saying, that actually, here's the situation. Society has been our society, our human society, we have been hopping along for thousands of years with one leg, the male leg. And we would all be benefited. Society would be very benefited by actually being able to walk in a balanced and, in fact, much happier and more productive way. With 2 legs. So very similar to Kofi's image. But what we also have to realize here is that we have thousands of years to make up for. And this again ties into what I was saying before. We are on a journey. We are on a journey toward gender parity. To be honest, it is not going to happen overnight. And I have 6 years of trying to get to gender parity at a UN institution, being able to take gender parity all the way up to the top levels. And I tell you, it is not easy. Why? Because traditionally, women have had less access to education, less access to the higher responsibility jobs, and hence, I don't get highly qualified, fantastic women in the numbers that I get highly qualified, fantastic men. It is very frustrating, but we cannot give up because we're on a journey and we are going to accelerate our path on that journey.
Vuk, I'm going to pull in another question from the audience. In the midst of the horrible refugee and migration crisis in the middle of Europe, although most people tend to forget that 85% of the refugees are actually in neighboring countries at war, not necessarily in Europe. We've coined the phrase for a very long time, or used the phrase that was coined during the Second World War, never again. Of course, we repeat that with some regularity, never again, over and over and over again. I'd just like to pull in a question from Simon Adams, who's the Executive Director of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. Simon.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to the candidates. It's nice to see you again, and also to Barbara. My question is this. We know, and I think most people in this room would agree, that the UN is a 20th century organization that is struggling to deal with 21st century problems. And I think no problem and no challenge has done more to undermine the integrity and the reputation of the UN than the inability to prevent and protect from mass atrocity crimes. So, at a time when 65 million people in the world are currently displaced by war, by mass atrocities, and by persecution, and atrocities are currently being perpetrated, of course, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, and elsewhere, how will you, as UN Secretary General, uphold the responsibility to protect the commitment that was made by all UN member states in 2005 to prevent genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity?
Thank you for this question. It's a very important one. Before answering it, I just want to add that I actually committed myself publicly answering the previous question that on day one, I intend to uphold 50-50 gender parity in the appointments of undersecretary generals and above. So day one is my publicly made commitment on this issue. When it comes to the responsibility to protect the mass atrocities, genocide, there is a concrete proposal that I had made, and this is to create a special task force that is going to meet monthly and going to be chaired by the Secretary General himself or herself to have all the disparate elements of the United Nations to be constantly monitoring and being able to work with the Security Council in particular and other parts of the system to make sure that the cry of never again really is addressed in the 21st century. There are several other practical policy proposals that I make, and I forgive you for, I hope you are going to forgive me for constantly referring to my platform. It is publicly available. I ask you to take a look at it in your free time. There are 53 concrete commitments.
Before or after reading Tom's book?
Yes.
Tom's book is an absolute starter. It inspired me in many ways, as Tom knows very well, to write this. But when it comes to the humanitarian crisis, which is probably the greatest humanitarian crisis that we're facing in UN history, I think that failing to reach financing targets is something that need to be addressed right on by the Secretary General. To that end, I propose 3 or 4 concrete things, one of which is a special UNSG envoy for philanthropic outreach to make up for the shortages in funding, but much more fundamentally when it comes to the refugee crisis, I think that the whole humanitarian relief machinery of the United Nations need to be overhauled. There is no time for us to get into details, but I do invite you, if you're interested in this, to take a look at what am I proposing, and I'd be very, very happy after this to get into more detail.
1 minute from each of you maybe on that topic. Is R2P dead? Is it a toxic brand, or does it have a future?
No, R2P is certainly not dead, but R2P shouldn't be interpreted in a reductionist sense. It's really a complex project which includes a variety of things that a responsible state has to do vis-à-vis its own citizens. And we have to place the first emphasis on that. We shouldn't start with the third pillar of it and think that that's the whole thing. I mean, there is the first and the second pillar, and there is a lot of work to do in that regard. I like to quote the example of, let's say, a Kenyan crisis several years ago, where an early intervention of African Union, United Nations, and everybody else helped preventing with a very clear and strong commitment of political actors within the country. And I think that that model has to be properly appreciated and followed wherever necessary.
Fully agree that you have to go through those pillars and then resort only as a last resort with the authorization of the Security Council. However, in addition to that, without contradicting that in the least, but I think it's also important to talk about the twin R2P. One is certainly responsibility to protect, but equally important and equally as urgent, and that's the problem that we don't give the urgency, is responsibility to prevent. Sure. Because frankly, mass atrocities and genocide does not happen overnight. And we have to increase our sensitivity to pick up the indicators of what is happening, mostly happening through already sustained disrespect for human rights, and that then leads to mass atrocities and genocide. And it is there where we actually need to put much more attention, because we in the UN, we're much better traditionally and historically at moving into emergencies and crises than we are at prevention. And if there's any leitmotif that I would certainly like to bring to the UN is to be able to balance these out and inject much more time and effort into prevention in all of its different manifestations, and certainly with atrocities.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing. The Security Council is what you'd have to deal with. Not wanting, well, first of all.
You mean when it comes to election, or what?
No, humanity. Well, that would be nice. The big power rivalries over different parts of the world. I mean, some of these things get in the way of humanitarian. People develop political views of why a humanitarian crisis happened. Well, you know that. But it's also the allocation of funds and things. That's GA, right? The General Assembly. But the Security Council has to. I mean, they can pass resolution after resolution, and they have. But a lot of things just die there. It's just a comment, and you don't necessarily have to add to that, because Tom wants to move generally to peace and security.
Where we already are.
Yeah.
Well, we got there, yeah.
Well, actually, we finally got there. Although that's where the conversation usually begins and it never gets off, which is the reason we decided to put it third. Everything else is kind of a residual of peace and security, but here we go. Actually, I'm going to come back to you, Christiana, here, trying to lead with one of you on each of these issues. But it seems to me the worst publicity I've seen in the 45 years I've been looking at the UN has happened over the last couple of years, including sexual abuse of children. I mean, it's kind of what could be worse? Or leaving behind a little cholera in Haiti, 10,000 deaths, 800,000 people infected. We had a couple of really good questions from UN staff, including a woman from Lebanon who says, one of the ways to help prevent this stuff is actually knowing about it quickly and not after the fact. So her question is, what can you do to improve the protection of whistleblowers across the system? Obviously, she had in mind Anders Campos and the scandal in Central African Republic, but there are lots of other examples. So the question to you, Christiana, is what can be done to improve the incentives for whistleblowers?
I do think that you've named two situations that are actually quite painful for the institution, and painful for the institution. I'd say painful for the world, because the institution does represent, should represent, and can represent, and must live up to the highest expectations of humanity. So it is not where we have put our best foot forward, and we need to be courageous enough to assume responsibility. Number one. And not to, have the perhaps understandable inclination of trying to delay assuming the responsibility. That cannot be done in an irresponsible way, because it must be done on the basis, certainly, of review and investigation. But when you have proof, we have to make we have to assume that responsibility. And we have to assume that we will recognize that although our staff and our blue helmets have immunity, that does not mean impunity. And that there is both a personal responsibility of those who have not lived up to the UN standards, but also there is an institutional responsibility. And at both levels, we need to align those two responsibilities and be bold enough and courageous enough to admit it publicly, and truly protect those who, well, whistleblowing is one way of saying it, but those who are more sensitive and are picking up that information, protect them, because honestly, what they want is the integrity of the institution. That is what they are talking about. So I do think that they deserve their time, and they cannot be allowed, of course, to say anything that is irresponsible. But if there is proof, and if there is a well-founded investigation that this has occurred, then we must assume our responsibility.
Barbara, you've written about these operations for years. Why don't you
Well,
jump in
I can ask Danilo and Vuk then here. There are three words. I mean, compensation, question mark. Should there be should the UN be compensating people for things that it can take responsibility for? I think that I would like to hear from you really concrete steps. For example, the status of forces agreement with peacekeeping countries, troop contributing countries, probably needs to be looked at hard. Most people say you can't do it. And Kofi Annan and others used to say, if we crack down on the way the individual national battalions are run, which is careless, and they accept a lot of bad behavior, we're going to lose all these troops. I mean, people aren't going to give us troops anymore. So that's always been the excuse. It is what someone at the New York Times called a defensive crouch. And because, well, we can't because of this and we can't because of that. But that's one thing. The compensation thing is very complicated because, in an international environment, you're going to get all kinds of claims for compensation that may be way off the issue. And then independent tribunals, but for troop contributors, they get off the hook too often. And I think that, again, would be very difficult. I just want to know if you've thought of Danilo and Vuk, really concrete things that need to be done, whether or not they can be done, because there have been so many reports on reforming peacekeeping.
Now, I'll answer this question, but I would like to say something about whistleblowers also. These sad stories remind of of a thought by Isaiah Berlin, who wrote about the crooked timber of humanity. And he came to the conclusion that, in fact, the reason for optimism about improvement of human behavior is in the ability of human persons to learn from mistakes. And I think that now the UN is in a very important situation when it needs to demonstrate its ability to learn from these recent mistakes. Now, what kind of policy on whistleblowers that produces is, of course, the next question. But I mean, the principle of learning from mistakes has to be really very firmly established. And we have to change the practice. I would like Andres Kompas to come back to the United Nations. I know him from years ago when he was heading a human rights office in Colombia, did a wonderful job. And I think that we shouldn't be losing good people in this kind of inadequate, wrong situations. We have to remedy things. Now, the idea of remedying brings me to your question about peacekeepers more directly. You know, remedy shouldn't be seen only in a medical sense or in a legal sense, in terms of legal remedies. The UN really has to think about remedying situation much more in ethical terms, because there is a need for a constant effort to improve peacekeeping and to remedy whatever is wrong. You see, there are improvements already. I mean, there are troop contributing countries who are taking much more serious measures to fight impunity, I mean, within their troops. I mean, we have to develop that culture further. And we have to make sure that criminal jurisdiction, which remains in the hands of troop contributing states, doesn't remain an idle promise. It has to be really implemented, and pressure is needed. And it is taking place, and it has to be stronger and stronger. So that would take care of part of the problem. And then, of course, thinking about remedying of situation, we shouldn't think about Haiti simply in terms of legal proceedings before the courts. And that's one type of thing. But we have to think about remedying this more in a broader sense, helping people, I mean, of course, improving the health system, investing much more heavily into the environments in which such vulnerability to cholera exists, and so on. So there are many things that could come under this rubric of remedying the situation in an ethical sense, and I would like to promote that. I do not have a prescription right now, coming back to the kind of more medical aspect of it. I don't have a prescription, but I think the direction is already emerging, and we have to work on this.
But there you need a national partner.
Sorry?
There you need a national partner.
Yeah.
And in some of the countries in which the UN works, that isn't what they have.
True, but that shouldn't be an excuse for not doing our own things right. I am familiar with the way in which the current investigations in Central African Republic are going. Mm-hmm. I am aware that not everything is perfect there. There is much room for improvement in ways in which UN operates in this kind of very sensitive situation when wrongs have to be remedied. Improvement for the UN is a separate task. It's our task. It is the task for the UN Secretariat and the Secretary General. And of course, partnership is important, but that shouldn't be decisive. We have to do our job better.
Well, very quickly, I think that just piecemeal and slow tinkering with what we have at the moment is just not going to be enough. I think that in real terms, this world is facing the most dire security situation probably since the Cuban crisis of 1962. And the shifting nature of security challenges is such that the UN is currently being left way behind when it comes to being able to address the real security challenges of today. So what I propose is that we do a radical overhaul of the entire peace and security dimension of the United Nations. We're either going to have a new generation of peace stabilization missions that are going to have much more robust rules of engagement and be structured in a way more efficient and hands-on way than anything that we have so far, or we should scrap the peace and security role of the United Nations altogether. Not pretend that they're good for something when they're not. I mean, look at what's been going on in the last couple of days in South Sudan. We're just praying that they're not shot, they don't die. We're not even thinking as to whether they're going to be able to protect the people who they were sent to protect in the first place. So unless there is a radical overhaul, and we need to do some really hands-on work, diplomatic work of the Secretary General is going to be critically important in this field. If we do not have a new generation of peace stabilization mission, we better not do it at all. Concentrate on sustainable development, concentrate on climate change, concentrate on advocating human rights, and leave peace and security to someone else. I think that would be a wrong thing to do.
Who's the someone else?
Well, I think that would be a wrong thing to do, because someone else would be just ad hoc coalitions or
NATO.
coalitions of the willing and so on and so forth. That did not work out too well in the past. I'd be strongly advocating, if electing, a radical overhaul of UN peacekeeping, and to that end, I put forward, I believe, 9 concrete policy proposals with timelines as to how this might be achieved.
Could I jump in very quickly on Haiti? Because I do think that Haiti actually represents an enormous opportunity for the United Nations, because there is a fantastic stacking of imperatives there. Danilo has spoken about the moral imperative, which truly is there. Independently of, whatever the legal outcome is, there is a moral imperative there that is undeniable. And I do think that, taking your argument, Danilo, one step farther, not only do we have to learn, we have to show everybody else that we have learned and we are doing things better. So I very much take your point on board. Then on top of the moral imperative, we have a fantastic development imperative, right? Even if the UN didn't have a responsibility for cholera in Haiti, what stops us from actually investing in the sanitation conditions that need to be put in place in an LDC that has had a history of being beset by every single disaster that you can possibly imagine? There is a moral imperative, there is an economic imperative, there's a SDG imperative, there's a health imperative, there's a humanity imperative. It's a huge opportunity. Let us not look at it as though it were, something terrible that the UN can't touch. It is a huge opportunity for the UN to reestablish itself and to truly breathe life again into the ethos of this organization.
If I can just add on
very briefly
to this. If you're not going to send somebody who is going to make a difference to a place like Libya and Yemen upon a political solution is found, if you are not going to follow it up with sending a proper structure to Syria upon a political solution is found, there's going to be no use for blue helmets. Then we should dedicate a huge part of the UN building to the Blue Helmet Museum, and just agree that this was a successful thing in the 20th century, and that unfortunately we were not capable of making it pertinent for the 21st.
We're all going to be frustrated. Barbara, all of her questions on terrorism, nuclear, WMDs, prevention, peace building are not, we're not going to get to those. One of the problems...
And then there's breakfast.
Yes. One of the problems with 1 million or 100 million people on streaming is that we actually have to finish more or less on time or we're in trouble. So I would like to shift now, particularly since I'd like to leave a couple of minutes at the end for each of you to say whatever you'd like to say. I wanted to come to this moral issue because it seems to me that on all of the questionnaires, right at the top of the list are mentioned the words integrity, independence, autonomy, da-da-da-da. Now, we may not know exactly what that means, but there's one thing it certainly does not mean, which is a couple of weeks ago, eliminating Saudi Arabia from a list of countries that was responsible for violence against children, talking about throwing a moral compass out the window. it seems to me that that qualifies. And we had lots of questions, but as Barbara has pointed out quite appropriately, there are these things called major powers, big powers. So the question, I guess for each of you will be, can you give me an example of some public gesture you've taken that has irritated one of the P5 or your government or your political party or whatever? A concrete example that suggests why those adjectives, having integrity and having being independent, apply. I'm going to start with you, Christiana, since you brought up this moral ethic, and then we'll move to Danilo and Vuk.
Sure. So I won't speak to P5s because I'm not SG yet, and therefore I don't deal with them in that relationship. But in order to get a global climate change agreement, it was very clear that there is a set of countries and there's a set of companies, the countries that export oil and gas and the companies that produce oil and gas, who were made, to put it mildly, very uncomfortable by the progress of climate policy. And I decided very early on that A, I would not demonize them, B, I would engage very, very actively with them, and I probably traveled more frequently to Saudi Arabia than to most any other country, because it was very clear to me that without having Saudi Arabia and the other oil-producing countries on board, we were not going to get a universal agreement. So it is about, again, having frank conversations. It is about not demonizing, but also not angelizing, by the way, anyone, but rather by truly understanding what is their interest, where do they see themselves in the future, where are they, and how can they be brought on board. And I would say I'm actually quite proud of the relationship that I was able to build with the oil-producing countries and companies, and I could tell stories about that as well, in order to get a unanimous Paris Agreement.
Danilo.
Ethics and diplomacy are inconvenient neighbors. But they are neighbors. And sometimes they have to interact in ways which are not expected. Of course, I could give you, I say this with some hesitation, but nevertheless, when I was in Barbara would remember that when I was presiding the Security Council in August 1998, that coincided with something that was happening in Kosovo, and it was called the Scorched Earth military action. Now, August is the time when Europe goes on vacation. And I was confronted by journalists in front of the Security Council chambers, and I was criticized. I said, oh, what is the Security Council doing? I mean, here we see bad things happening and very little is being done. Well, I said, look, the Security Council is trying to do its best. I'm authorized to talk to the Secretary General of NATO and OSCE. I am trying to start some kind of diplomatic action at a time when it's not very convenient for many. And of course, there was an Associated Press correspondent who very meticulously took down my statement. And that led to a lot of discussion, none of which was public at the time. And of course, there was a lot of talk of how does the President of the Security Council dare to speak about summer vacations and trivialize this problem and so forth. So, it led to a situation in which obviously sensitivities were raised. And there was subsequent activity in the months that came. The resolutions were there, the proposals were made. But I have sensed in that situation how important it is sometimes to do a little bit of risky thing. Although you would say, well, the President of the Security Council can afford this kind of risky diplomatic gesture. I would say it's not something that comes automatically. You have to decide whether to do it or not. And you know, this is one of the experiences. I deliberately took an example which is slightly more sensitive, but I think we have to be honest about this. In the UN, in the security issues, things like this happen practically on a daily basis. And you're always walking a fine line between what is convenient diplomatically and what is necessary morally.
Boog, what's in?
I'll give a very concrete example. I served as a president of the UN General Assembly, and one of the prerogatives of the president is to call for thematic debates on issues that he or she finds important, pertinent to international order. And one of the thematic debates that I decided to hold was on international criminal justice, which I believe is a very important topic. And I think in certain parts of the world it's a very controversial topic, especially in Africa and amongst a certain number of member states. A lot of people feel that it's not working in a perfect way. So I thought that this was an important topic to be brought to the membership in the General Assembly. I decided to call it. Then I was approached by some very powerful member states of the United Nations with a demand to withdraw from this, and I refused. So the way it played out was suboptimal, and there are certain lessons that I have learned from this exercise. There could have been a better outreach. Perhaps I, coming from a particular place that causes certain grievances with respect to certain other people from the same area, wasn't the best person to do it. I never thought that this was ever going to be a problem. I thought that my own background, coming from a mixed background, being half Serbian, half Bosnian, being somebody who had fought the dictatorship in my country as a young man, would have never been brought into question as a person of integrity to call for a debate on an issue which nobody can deny is pertinent to international affairs. But it did prove to be controversial. However, I was faced with an immense pressure by not insignificant players to just back down and to give up. I didn't. I tried my best that this debate was as inclusive as possible. It actually proved to be the biggest debate in the history of the UN in terms of the number of countries participating. I think it proved out to be a success. But at some point, I believe that people in the position of, say, PGA or Secretary General need to show that they have certain spine. And of course, one has to use his or her courage wisely. But in the position of such significance, there has to be independence and ethics, as Danilo was mentioning, and that characteristics ought to be characteristics of the next SG.
I'd like to get to one last question because we've been throwing a lot of flowers in the direction of 1 for 7 billion. Sorry, Natalie. And you know, there are downsides to this exercise, and one of the people who's been associated with articulating some of the downsides is Alvaro de Soto. So I'm going to ask him to throw his dose of cold water here before we come back to a final go-round, if we may. Alvaro.
I'm not sure whether cold water is what is the recipe for tonight.
Please speak up.
Let me start by simply commenting, if I may, that we probably wouldn't be here conducting this open exercise for the sake of transparency if the Security Council had done its job seriously in taking the initiative proactively of searching for a Secretary General. And we would probably not have had this massive gathering, both physical and virtual through live streaming, and this campaign for transparency if the Security Council had done its job. And of course, the responsibility falls mainly on the permanent members of the Security Council. Now, it has been said, it has been argued that no one should ever be a candidate for this position, strictly speaking. And the reason for this is that the argument goes that the heart and soul of the Secretary General's role in the area where he actually has a charter responsibility, which is the maintenance of international peace and security, through Article 99, and not only under the charter, but also through the practice of Secretaries General, starting with Hammarskjöld, he must be in a position to be strictly, or he or she, must be in a position to be strictly impartial. And if one is a candidate, one campaigns. And if one campaigns, there will always be the impression or the suspicion that, well, deals were struck, commitments were made, and thereby impartiality suffers, and therefore the candidate is somewhat weakened. Now,
Alvaro,
I'm coming to the question. I'm coming in for a landing, Tom. What assurance can you give us as candidates that you will be impartial and that you will not be making commitments in advance of becoming Secretary General, if one of you does indeed become Secretary General?
Okay. So I'd really like this to be a minute for each of you. Have you given away the store? Nilo.
Well, if I knew that Alvaro was in the audience, I would be even more careful in my remarks. But I think that, we live in a period of history where the interaction between the General Assembly and the Security Council is simply different from what it used to be. Now we see a degree of convergence between what's happening in the General Assembly, where by consensus, that means including all the Security Council members, the Assembly decided on the procedure. And we are all working within this framework. This makes the whole idea of the search committee much larger. Search committee now is no longer a committee. It's the whole membership and, of course, the global public. So we have to work in this kind of environment, like it or not. Secondly, as far as the assurances are concerned, I think that each of candidates has some history. I mean, we are not new people. We are not entirely new in this international diplomatic and other activity. And I believe that the only guarantee can be derived from very careful look at what we have been doing so far, what we are doing today, and that gives the sense who might be the right person.
Christiana, you're nodding your head.
Yes, I would agree with that, and I would say no, I have not given away anything in the store, certainly not. But let me say this: I shall be impartial, but I will not be indifferent. That's very, very different concepts. I will not be indifferent because what motivates me truly here is the fate of the most vulnerable and the most marginalized, and I think we have to keep a moral compass here. I will also be independent, as I have proven to be independent over the 6 years that I have proudly served the United Nations, but I will be independent with a deep commitment to collaboration and to collective wisdom. And it is in those complementary skill sets and those complementary commitments, I think, that you can find the way forward and the leadership that is needed at this point.
Book, please.
I made 53 commitments. I made them publicly available, and there are no additional commitments that I had made to anyone, nor there are any additional commitments that I plan on making. So I'm very transparent in what I stand for. I agree with Danilo that we're all, in a way, known quantities, for better or for worse. I think that independence is an important quality for the future Secretary General. So I think the member states ought to take that into consideration. I beg to disagree with you when it comes to the election. I've heard this argument, actually I heard this argument from you before in Paris earlier this year. I think election is good. And I think democracy is good and transparency is good. And although I do understand the argument, I think that the more openly and the more transparently we do this process, in which we will have to fight for it, and whether it is worth fighting for or not, it's another matter.
Sorry,
But
I'm
I think
not
it's
fighting.
important.
I'm contributing. Just to make sure.
I am fighting.
I'd like to have
And,
just.
That's fine.
And I think we all are in different ways, but I think it is important that it is brought up to an audience like this, to an audience like we had a chance to address last night, and across the world. I think the more transparency in this process, the better for everybody in the future.
I'd like to give each of you a minute more, 90 seconds, I guess we could make it. We've heard a lot of things, bad publicity, sacrosanct state sovereignty, bureaucratic ineptitude, and the list goes on. Yesterday evening, somebody asked, why in the hell would anyone want to drink from this poison chalice? So that is the question. In fact, there was, I thought, a very, very interesting last sentence in an open letter from the staff, which says something like, with so many lives and livelihoods in the balance, we will, that is the staff, be inspired and enabled to reach higher by a leader who personifies the best of the UN. What is the best of the UN, and how could you contribute to that? Christiana, we'll start with you.
I think the best of the UN is when we prove once and again that multilateralism does work, that it can and it should. And when we as an organization representing the nations of the world are able to stand up to the highest expectations of humanity, fully well understanding that there is no perfect solution for anything, but that we have to do our utmost. And let me just take one page from a fantastic 10-year-old in South Africa who wrote a song and performed it in front of me, and she said, together with her other friends, do more, do more, do more. And when you've done everything you can, do more again. That is the UN.
Thank you. Boog.
Well, I'd say that the best of the UN is not good enough. What we have right now is simply not good enough. And if we continue in this direction and at this speed, we are sooner rather than later going to become not fit for purpose to serve humanity in the 21st century. I believe we need to change. And I believe we need to try and do it fast. And I think that we must try and do it together in a very transparent way. And unless we make this significant joint effort, we're just going to suffer the League of Nations in between the two world wars.
Danilo.
The best of the UN is often unexpected. I remember Nelson Mandela when he came to the UN General Assembly in 1994, and he made a speech in which he said, I was in prison at the time when UN was advocating the ending of apartheid. It looked impossible to you, but it was vital for us in prison. And I would like to thank you for insisting on ending of apartheid. Now, I think that there is a very important moral message in this. UN is doing very good things, some of which are not immediately recognized. And we have to be sufficiently patient and sufficiently wise to appreciate all the good work that the UN is doing. And therefore, when critical remarks are made about the UN, we have to respond with this kind of moral certitude which is based on actual achievement of the United Nations. This is not easy, and it has to be also practical. And I would like to end my remarks by advertising another book that you wrote, Tom.
This is
That is about
invite you
global,
guys back.
about global governance, in which you argue that we have a need for global governance without a global government. And obviously, UN is the centerpiece of that global governance without a global government. And what makes UN special and the centerpiece? The wisdom of the Charter and the moral effect of its work in many areas. Let us not forget that. Let us take some courage and strength from the past achievements. It's not easy, but it is absolutely necessary.
We're not starting from scratch.
Good.
That's right. Well, what an evening. For those of you who are not native New Yorkers, you may not realize you're in the basement of what used to be called B. Altman's, which was supposedly, I wasn't in the basement, everyone's favorite department store. We are now a different kind of marketplace for ideas and people and encounters, and it was, for me, a really terrific conversation. Some insight, some humor, some openness. And so on behalf of Global Citizen, UNA UK, the Graduate Center, the Bunche Institute, I'd like to thank Barbara for joining me, and Vu, Christiana, and Danilo for being here. I just want to say that, in closing, I'm speaking for you, Chase, here, that after one of you is selected, you're most welcome to come back and give your first policy address here. Thank you.